language we're using here is diversity. We're talking about that. Do you ever wish that you weren't the diversity, that you could find that center? Do you ever find in Japan, which must be a place where you will never completely be one of them, nor would I or most anybody, where diversity is not valued completely. Do you ever find yourself unsettled by that and wishing that, okay, I'd like to trade that all in for a place where I could just pass?
There are a lot of questions in there, so I could go on for the next 3 or 4 hours. But briefly, no. So, when I was growing up as a little boy, I thought it'd be wonderful to be a basketball player, because I love NBA basketball, but I'm not 6'9". I also thought it'd be lovely to look like Brad Pitt, but I never will. So I thought that the peculiar circumstances of my upbringing had disqualified me for many, many things, as my height and my skin color or the hair color do, such hair as I have. But on the other hand, it had qualified me for many, many other things, such as adaptability. That to this day, age 58, I have never owned property. I feel at home in Los Angeles airport. I don't know what people are talking about when they refer to their gardens. On the other hand, when I'm in North Korea or Paraguay or Yemen, I don't feel unsettled, because as a little boy, England, California, and India were all somewhat foreign to me. And I think in some ways that's one reason, perhaps I was saying to Ratna earlier today, why I've chosen to live in the most foreign place of all, Japan, because I feel naturally at home in the margins, maybe, as you said, and outside of things. And I wouldn't, if in the times in my life where I've been in the midst of a community, a part of me has longed to flee that. And as you know, as a fellow writer, a writer wants to be removed, even if you're writing about your hometown or your mother and father. You have to be removed to be in the same position as the reader. So it's maybe my writer's reflex, and maybe it's just that I grew up most comfortable at least having one foot outside. And I love what you said about the transitional places. And I think, as I heard you talk, I thought, well, maybe my sense of home and my sense of self has always been a work in progress. It's always been a sentence I haven't completed or a question that I haven't answered. And in some ways, I think 100 years ago, people were united by the answers and assumptions they shared. Now, perhaps, many of us are united by the questions that we ask. So home and the notion of home has never been something I wanted to complete. Or I'd gladly live in Japan for the rest of my life. But as Ratna said, I choose to live on a tourist visa as a way of reminding myself I can't claim to be a Japanese, nor would the Japanese ever want to claim me as one of them. And it must be said, I don't want to give an endless answer, but a few years ago, every time I returned to Japan, 3 times a year, as soon as I arrived in my local airport, I would be whisked off into a small room and strip searched. Mm-hmm. I look exactly like what the Japanese don't want to see coming into their country. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they thought I was an illegal Iranian immigrant. Sometimes they thought I was a terrorist. Sometimes they thought I was what I am, somebody of Indian origin, and they weren't so happy to see that in their country. Until one day I was flying in from Hong Kong, and there was somebody else of Indian descent there. And I said, does this happen to you? And he looked at me as if I were a kindergarten. He said, no, of course not, because if there are 9 customs lanes manned by men, and there's one run by a woman, just go to the one with a woman, and she will usher you in. And I've been doing that ever since, and I've never got strip searched. But
I won't tell them.
No, and it's not because the women don't want to strip search me. It's because...
Of course they don't.
Yeah, we won't go there, but it's because they have every... in my limited experience, the women in Japan are very keen to speak foreign languages, to make contact with the foreign world, to marry foreigners, because they know they have many more opportunities outside Japan than within the traditional system, whereas the men have everything to gain by staying within Japan. So some of my friends say, well, why would you want to live in a country where they strip search you every time? As soon as I'm through customs, of course, the Japanese people couldn't be kinder and more gracious, whatever they think of me. But also, one of the things that draws me to Japan is the whole culture functions almost like an orchestra. And each person is playing from the same piece of music. She knows her part, and she plays it impeccably, with the result there's a great public harmony. And so understandably for them, when a foreigner comes in who doesn't even know what the music is, he brings the threat of disruption and disharmony to their country. And they have good reasons for feeling unsettled when people like I come there. And I have good reasons for rejoicing in a country that functions so smoothly and with such kindness and graciousness to me after I've made it through customs.
I'm glad you acknowledged that about the trickiness of crossing those thresholds, because of course diversity is one of those words that it's a little too static. It sort of assumes that it's this thing that's there. You're the diversity. You can walk around and so on. I don't have to be the diversity. I can just sit back and enjoy it, at least in Toronto, and increasingly less. When you were here a decade and a half ago and you gave a lecture, and I was struck by something you said in talking about Toronto. And the hybridity, mongralism, I think was the term you used to describe it, which was a way to capture a bit of the social unacceptability that exists in it. That it's not just fun being hybrid. And 1, 2, 3, there. You wrote, the process of mingling cultures is a messy one, rough at the edges and not easily soothed into placid euphemisms. Every time two worlds cross, a spark of uncertainty and fear rises up between them, something visceral and primal that comes with a scent of danger. And I mean, it's hard not to think of those Mediterranean migrants floating in the sea when you think of that, but it's also hard not to think of the extreme risk that even the most prosaic of migrants take. I mean, you could make a life in Toronto just asking people, how did your family get here? And almost everybody has a story that is extraordinary and perilous and full of trauma and loss and danger. I mean, what we look at as being a colorful tapestry is made up of a huge number of extremely dangerous and violent risks. At some point, you sit back and wonder about those who become diverse through a process of danger and challenge.
You're the expert on that. And actually, I think even some of the statistics I was citing came from your recent article in which you unfolded the whole story of what's going on in the Mediterranean. So, I mean, you're the one who's really been following that, and I not. But you're right, whenever I get into a taxi here, what I find is people are very happy to tell their stories, and they tend to be stories with semi-happy endings. Again and again, I would hear the Gonda story, and of how Canada, it seemed almost gratuitously, opened its arms with extraordinary compassion to people and put them up for a long time and gave them a whole new future. And my first question of the immigrants when I meet them is, how do you find it here? And I'm startled at how often the responses are really positive. I was in Vancouver 6 weeks ago, and I've been in Toronto this week. And again, I must admit, I keep waiting to be disenchanted by Toronto, and it doesn't happen, hasn't happened yet, even though
come in January sometime.
Yes. People used to ask me, why do you not live in Toronto if you love it so much? And I said the winter. So you're right, I've condemned myself. But and I didn't even recognize those words you read, but I guess I did write them or say them once upon a time. But I think, you're on the front line of seeing the people lose their loved ones, and you've been watching that. But you've also, I loved what you said about not being static, because one of the things I learned from your book, which I see as a companion piece to the beautiful book Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo, is that what we lazily see as just fixed settlements full of shacks are all about movement and all about people going somewhere, and in fact are positive places for many of them. And I think that was what you were writing about in Arrival City. That what you were writing about recently regarding the Mediterranean had to do with losses and I guess why people would even undertake such risks.
Well, and risks, right? and the trade-off of death for the risk of permanence, almost.
Yes.
Millions of Africans moved back and forth freely between the African continent and Europe. Between harvest seasons until the 1990s when they decided to start patrolling the borders.
Yes.
And of course it was the fascinating thing about that, and this struck me as something almost out of your works, is that by trying to control it, the possibility of it being temporary ended. The idea of having border controls meant that the idea of people moving back and forth for a season became impossible, and the only form of movement possible became a permanent lifetime one.
Yes.
And I think that's happening to a lot of people, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one thing I learned from your book was how much reverse migration there is. I think you describe a Chinese village where after Chinese New Year, you said a fifth of the people go back sort of permanently to the village if they're not under the control of laws like the ones
so
you
much
described.
movement in the world now is like that. and really always has been. There's some really interesting research now on how the Ellis Island migration to the United States has been misanalyzed because such a large proportion of people in the 19th century were coming and going. I know that until about the 1920s, the vast majority of people who immigrated to Canada stayed for a few months and went to the United States. We're a country of immigration, but we're also a country of emigration. People use it as a stepping stone.
Yeah.
And I think there's a new understanding of migration that it's never been and isn't now a matter of a family. You know, when I started working on Arrival City, I remember I thought I'm going to begin one chapter by finding a family in a rural village somewhere, and you know, if 5 million families a month move to an urban area, I should be able to find this easily. We're just loading all their stuff onto the bus or the train or whatever to move to a city. And find them on the day when they're doing that. It'll be a great opening for the chapter. And after a couple of years of work on this, I finally realized this never happens. It has never happened. No family has ever except unless they're expelled in conflict migration, no family has ever said, let's just become urbanites or let's just move to another country. It's always some person from the family. The stereotype is it's a male breadwinner, but it's often historically and even today been a woman from the family who sets a foot and maybe lives in a room with 20 people and then invites another relative over when they realize that the money's good, and maybe then rents a whole house, maybe buys a house, and slowly a family that thought of itself as being a rural foreign family getting a little bit of extra money from over there realizes that it's an urban family in another country with a foot back in the old farm or something.
Yeah. Well, I think that dynamism is what really invigorates nations. In that first book of mine, which I wrote 30 years ago, actually, Video Night in Kathmandu, I remember thinking that the American dream was getting new life breathed into it by the immigrants. And if you thought of the traditional American values as championed by Ronald Reagan or Norman Rockwell, family unity, hard work, possibility, ambition, that wasn't always so evident among the people who'd been in America for a couple of generations, but each new person from Vietnam and Taiwan and Hong Kong and India who was arriving there was an embodiment of that and was living Americanness much more intensely than anyone around. They were importing hope and re-importing freshness into that notion. And they believed so strongly in the American dream before they came there that it became a reality, it became a self-fulfilling promise. And although the Canadian dream is a different one, I'm sure some equivalency here insofar as you say, those are agents of movement and of restlessness and of looking around the next corner, and that's a great thing for a country to have, so that we don't get complacent and stuck in our ways. That's probably what's happening in Britain, too.
I hope so. And well, we may know differently about that in the morning.
Yes, quite, yes.
You know, one thing you said in passing to me when we were talking on the phone earlier that's captivated me is this idea that people who migrate are making a bargain, are trying to make a decision between having an identity or having prosperity. And that you can have one or the other.
Yes.
You have to give up some of what you thought of as your identity if you're going to do better. Or if you want to hold on to what you thought of as your real self, as your authentic self, whatever that was, you probably won't do as well.
Yeah. I think that's probably the heartbreak of many a household, even among non-migrants, but most visibly among migrants, which is that the parents naturally want their children to succeed, but the more the children succeed, the greater their distance from their parents. And they begin to speak a language, literally and metaphorically, that their parents can't follow. One of my favorite writers on migration, Richard Rodriguez, the really thoughtful and provocative Mexican-American writer, describes how, as a bright kid who was getting offered scholarship after scholarship, each time he came back to the family dinner table and told his Spanish-speaking parents, I've just been offered a chance to go to Columbia or Princeton or wherever it is, the silences grew longer. And in the very motion of championing their son, they were losing him. And of course, that could happen to somebody from rural Ontario who's coming to the U of T and creating a new identity. It's not peculiar to international migrants. But you're right, that every parent must have mixed feelings, and every child mixed feelings about the abandoning of earlier generations that success in a new country might involve.
I think there's a whole unexplored work on the psychology of migration, of these split families. I mean, all over the world, and you've seen them, are places where there are villages that contain what they call the hollow villages in China, that contain only people, only children and grandparents. And it's true in Romania, you see them as well, where every working age person has moved, in the case of Romania, to Italy, in the case of China, to one of the cities in China, and a whole generation grows up without its parents.
Yes, exactly, and I often think, I'm crying out for the book to be written about the Philippine diaspora, and maybe people have done it, especially in Toronto, but so many of affluent Westerners in Hong Kong say, their children are entirely raised by Filipinos. Most of my friends in California report that their parents, when they get old, in their last years are entirely taken care of by Filipinos, all of whom are obliged by financial necessity to neglect to be away from their own kids at home in order
their own
to
children.
protect their kids.
There are villages in Luzon, in the Philippines, that are entirely full of children who see their mothers every 2 years. And there's some great work to be written on the displaced psychology.
They're the nurses and the nannies and the many other things of the world. And it's extraordinary what they're bringing out into the world. And, I think one thing that didn't come up in my talk, but obviously many of the writers on this subject, including myself, come from this tiny, very fortunate minority. And the great number of people experiencing migration are in a much more undefended situation than we are. And I think that has made for a problem, because the spokespeople for migration aren't the ones really suffering through it in the same way. And when we read a Salman Rushdie or Michael Ondaatje or whoever it might be, they have these beautiful visions of the Mongol community. But nonetheless, the person who's just arrived after 6 years in a Kenyan refugee camp probably has a very different story. That's the story that really needs to be told, which probably people like you are telling.
Well, we can talk about these migrations as a disruption in the modern corporate sense of the word disruption, as something that shakes things up and creates something new and exciting. And that may be true for everyone, but I think in many cases it's a disruption in the classic sense, in that it's a violent shock to the system. I think a lot of the happy communities around us were built from traumas and expulsions and ripped apart families and so on. And you can look back from 30,000 feet and you can say, well, this has created something much better than what had come before. But of course, as we were saying, those at the border, at the transition point, it can be quite a shocking thing.
Yeah, because I think most of the people probably who have migrated out of necessity rather than choice, and were propelled out of their homes, would you say, by famine, poverty, warfare?
Maybe. Although there's a paradox in that those, I find, who do make it out of, even those who are refugees who are expelled, and those who come from impoverished places, those who leave the village, those who get out of the conflict, tend to be the most ambitious, those who have the best connections, those who are most educated, those who've saved the most. They're the best of the best. And given that half of them end up giving up and saying, no, I'm not going to make a go of it, you end up with the most resilient of the most resilient.
In fact, I think that's part of what you were writing about the recent certain events in the Mediterranean. These are not desperate people; they're driven people in some ways.
They're extremely ambitious people. Yes. Often with traumas behind them, often with entire villages to support. But they have a project rather than, they're not victims. They're agents.
Yeah. Which goes back to really your first question, because I think when you were talking about my interest in the edge and in between spaces, I probably always grew up with a sense that a home is not the place I came from, it's the place I'm going. And I'd rather be defined by my direction than the origins that feel very remote to me. And that home is not the place where I live, but it's what lives inside me. And home is not just the address that you happen to write on an immigration form, but it's the place where you feel understood, which, for example, in my case, is in an entirely alien society such as Japan, which nonetheless makes sense to me in ways that I can't even explain and feels like home. And so I think many of the people you're describing would say, my home is where I'm going. I'm making it up as I go along, they would be saying.
I think we should turn to the audience, I think, because I suspect many of the people here are, I suspect if you surveyed the people in the audience here, you'd have 100 different opinions about whether their home, the place that they feel in their heart is their home, is a place behind them or a place where they are now or a place that's yet to go. I think that the dotted lines running through people's lives are very interesting here. So
It's hard to
let's
see
take some
everybody with
questions,
those
yes. I
bright
think
lights.
we'll have to rely on the people with the microphones
Okay, yep.
to be directing that, yes.
Oh,
Thank you,
nice.
House Lights.
Yeah. It's quite hot in those lights.
Perhaps I'll pose the first question. Over here on the stage, left, I guess. Over here, by the door.
Oh, yes.
This side.
There you
Yeah,
are.
yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. I'm a veteran of at least a few of your books, so I feel a privilege to listen to you personally. Paint for me or explain to me why, given the power and the privilege and the pleasures of diversity, whether it's music or cuisine or, as you said, the globalized soul, that there are still individuals, whether it's governments in this country or elsewhere, that can use the anti-immigrant, the othering strategy for nefarious benefits. Why does that still exist?
I think when we're confronted by the other, some of us are drawn towards it and some of us are thrown back on our own resources. Some people are unsettled, some are fascinated. And it's not very difficult to play on those tribal instincts and to say your tribe is going to be the loser if this group comes in. So as I was saying, I think it's a natural human impulse often to think in divisive terms, and it's not difficult for those people who want to mobilize or win the votes of others to play upon their fears and their enmities, in the same way that politicians who are losing popularity will suddenly create an external enemy as a way to unite the nation. What do you think?
I think it's something you always be vigilant about is the idea that there is a fixed and homogeneous we that is confronted by an outside they, and this is a more recent concept than I think most people acknowledge. The idea that there is a national culture and language, even in Western European countries that we think of as having those. I mean, at the time of the eve of the First World War, close to half the people in France neither spoke French nor considered themselves French as an ethnicity. And that's not immigrants. That was the people within that country. And that's a country that unlike Germany, which had only been created 20 years before, or Italy, which was only about 25 years old then, or Spain, which really hadn't quite yet formed into a country, was at least had a geographical solidity to it. So I think it was the two world wars that, to a very large extent, even created the idea that there were fixed and homogeneous national cultures. And never mind places like Britain, that was always a composite of four incompatible nations and cultures. So I think the artificial creation of the notion of a fixed cultural we is a very recent invention, and it's one that gets used politically to manipulate ideas about migration over and over again, and we need to police that.
I was telling Ratner, in fact, earlier today that I covered 6 Olympic Games partly to see how 197 cultures interact in the same small space. Of course, the Olympic Games are a perfect paradigm of what Doug was just saying, because they're a celebration of the unity of mankind, but they're predicated on national divisions, and in fact, in some ways, they intensify those national divisions. But yes, in 1703, Daniel Defoe was saying a true-born Englishman's a contradiction. So you're right.
You may notice in the World Cup, that other big sporting event, there is no Britain team, of course.
Yeah, that's right.
There are four national teams from within there, and they invented it and so on. So even the dividing lines are very tricky.
And most of the players from England are ones that many people were not so keen to see coming into England not long ago. So,
I actually thought that was a very important moment in England when the England team started to be people who had skin colors and last names that weren't like mine.
Yeah.
And you could feel it. I was at that point in the 80s that your average guy in a pub could no longer look at them and say, no, they're not English, because they have the word England written on them and they're playing for our team. You know?
Yeah.
It's a subtle thing, and it certainly didn't solve all the problems, but I think it was the beginning of a change.
Yes. I did sense, I read your book, Global Soul, and what I get from there was, the feeling of loss, right? That feeling that you had at the airport of a civilization that starts to live in those airports, in little colonies, right? And there is a feeling of lost, right, somehow. And today, I mean, I see you in two positions. One of being sorry for this loss, and the other one for being grateful for this diversity. Which one is prevailing? You are born as a prototype of a migrant, right? In a immigrant family in England and so on. But then you choose to live in a very monocultural society in rural Japan, where is that guy who says everybody should be a farmer, Yatanabe, the guy who the revolution, or the straw revolution, right? The people who wants to, to stay in their places. So what is that great about everybody migrating to central cities like Toronto? And prosperity might be for some, but that prosperity comes with a loss for the home countries. Right? So, it's true that the Royal Bank is sponsoring this event, but the Royal Bank is also the great beneficiary of this migration.
Yes.
Right? And my question is, so how do you feel that these monocultures are, you spoke about the symphony, the orchestra that you felt there. What is the difference between that orchestra and the cacophony of those multicultural cities?
Yeah, again, a lot of questions there. Thank you, really thoughtful questions. So the global home, the global soul, there's a Freudian slip. The first chapter in it was called The Burning House, because my house literally burnt down and I lost everything I owned in the world, and I had to define home inwardly. The last chapter is called The Alien Home, and it's about the progression from a house to a home. So I'm no longer inhabiting just my parents' physical construction. I'm inhabiting a very alien place that is exactly where I want to be. As we were talking earlier today, I was thinking, actually listening to Doug, I was thinking, well, maybe I am drawn to Japan because it has such a strong sense of rootedness, and because I'm interested to partake at a distance vicariously in this very strong community, and because I love the sense of cycles and seasons, and it's more grounded than any place I know, which may have some of the virtues of symphony. But I'm also a great believer in secret homes, and I don't want to sound too mystical, but as the years go on, I feel that I never trust what I can explain, or I most trust what I can't explain. And I think many of us have these, we feel a strong sense of affinity with countries with which we have no official affiliation. Just the way in a crowded room like this, you may meet a stranger and you feel you know that stranger better than you know your friends and family. And I think often people have that strong magnetic pull towards ancient cultures. Egypt, China, India, Peru, Mexico, there are many, many of them. So as a little boy, when my parents would take me to the local museum in Oxford, and I saw a Japanese painting from the 19th century, I would feel I recognized that place better than I recognized the street in which I had grown up or the house in which I was living. And that's one reason I made my way to Japan in spite of some of the logistical difficulties, and one reason why I'd always want to go there, because I feel at some level below the surface, though I don't speak much Japanese, I don't eat Japanese food, and I don't wear Japanese clothes, I'm completely in sync with it. And I was telling somebody just on the way over here, and I'm not exaggerating, that I have much more serious communications problems in California, where there's the illusion of a common language, than in Japan, where we are very conscious of the distances between us, and therefore the need to communicate across those distances as clearly as possible. And some would say there's a clarity and a certainty in Japan because it makes such a sharp distinction between who's inside and who's outside. When I'm in California, and this may apply to some of you in Canada, I'm extremely warmly welcomed, but I will never feel Californian. So at some level, I'll never be a part of it inwardly, though America would be more than happy to give me a passport and everything that goes with it. When I'm in Japan, I know exactly that I'm out, and there's a reassurance that comes with that. So I don't feel a loss in living in a very foreign culture, because I suppose it's the difference between surface and depth, and on the surface it couldn't be more foreign, and deep down it couldn't feel more familiar. And many people are surprised that I speak very little Japanese. My Japanese wife speaks barely more English, and we've been happily together for 28 years. And it's not because we don't talk, it's because when we do talk, we're not using words as a weapon or a shield or a diversion. We're talking to communicate. And so I feel I have a much purer, clearer communication with her than I might with somebody in England or California, say. doesn't quite answer your question, but and I think when you put your finger on two convergent elements, clearly that was the tension that I was using to drive that book forwards, because no situation is unequivocal. And when Doug was asking me if I ever wished not to be diverse, although I never did, I have to admit and acknowledge it's an incomplete formulation, as is non-diversity too. All of us are incomplete, I think.
You're being too humble and insufficiently entrepreneurial, and that you should have plugged your most recent book at that moment, which is all about the pleasures of sitting still and being in one place. I mean, it opens on Mount Baldy with Leonard Cohen in his Buddhist repose and so on, and it answers many of these questions.
Thank you.
I was intrigued by your comment about being rooted in the absence of a place. So I'm from the Philippines. My family and I came here in 1990, and even though we visit quite often, I still feel disconnected to an extent. So my question is, what is your advice for youth who are, especially now, so desperately trying to belong and so publicly? What is your advice to them who are trying to define themselves based on their passion or based on their purpose, if they are rooted in the absence of a place or in the absence of being connected to somewhere?
To me, the two go together. In other words, passion is one's response to the absence of a place. Because I think we have to be grounded in things that don't change. And one of the conundrums of the modern world, which I'm sure you can relate to, is that home itself is a work in progress and constantly shifting. So every time you return, if you were to think of the Philippines as home, every time you return there, it would be a different country. And while you are living in Canada, it's moving into new stages of its evolution. So even the street or the town or the building that you thought of as home is being torn down or repurposed or surrounded by new places. And I was just doing a public conversation with Michael Ondaatje, great Torontonian, 5 days ago in Boston. And I was talking to him about Sri Lanka, and I was saying he left Sri Lanka 61 years ago. He feels such a strong imaginative connection with it, but part of the predicament of that connection is that Sri Lanka has been through a 26-year-long civil war. The tsunami wiped out another 30,000 people. That the very home that he would want to reclaim every time he goes back is unrecognizable to him, even if his house was still there. And I think that's why passion to me, or rooting yourself in, that's why Leonard Cohen lives in Mount Baldy, to be honest, because he's rooting in something that isn't affected by the seasons or the news. And I think the modern world is built on such shaky foundations that even if you're living in the United States or Canada and your ancestors have been here for a long time, you nonetheless are aware of having to root yourself in something deeper than your nation, whether it's a faith or a commitment to a cause or something that's going to be solid, something out of time that allows you to move through time. So yes, I think commitment to a physical home is precarious because you're giving your heart to quicksand and the tide is moving in very quickly. That silenced everybody.
No, thank you for your talk today. It's been a treat. I have a few words that you used earlier in your lecture stayed with me. You said we're all migrants and we're all minorities. Do you find yourself using a new language to describe difference in cities that are increasingly diverse and landscapes that are eternally changing?
Yeah, thank you, because I think language is part of the problem. And again, on the flight over here, I was suddenly thinking, for example, V.S. Naipaul has brought out the same book sometimes in the US and in England, and in one place it's been defined as fiction and in the other as non-fiction. And I was remembering how if I were in England today, I would be an Asian American. If I'm filling out a form in the United States, I have to remember never to check the box that's saying Asian American or the box that says Indian. I'm suddenly some new category, East Indian or...
South Asian or something.
Yeah, something like that. But well, not even Asia doesn't... Yeah, I think in the United States, Asia and India are regarded as separate entities.
In Britain... That's right. Asian means Indian subcontinent, and Oriental means East Asia. And now, of course, if you're in India, they refer to some place called West Asia, which is what we'd call the Middle East.
Yes, yes. And I loved all the London fried chicken joints in Bangladesh you describe in your book.
Yes, that's right.
But so I think language gets in the way again. And when I was thinking of visible minorities, which you have here, they're not a minority and they're less and less visible because if a Pakistani marries a Hungarian, what do you do with the complexion that results? Is it visible or not? So, yes. So I suppose, when I say that I'm eager not to define myself by nation states, I'm probably eager not to use for definitions these cumbersome terms that actually don't begin to apply. And I think if somebody comes up to you and you feel a strong, intimate connection with them and you start to describe yourself to them, I'm guessing nation-state words are not the first that you use. Religious words, maybe, but you're more likely to say what you do for a living, what drives you, what is propelling you into the future. And those seem like more substantial definitions, perhaps. And so, yes, I usually wouldn't call myself a minority or even necessarily a migrant, because I think the people who are really suffering deserve those titles and have earned them more than I.
Ratna, yes. I know.
Thank you very much, Pico and Doug, Pico, for that little wonderful glimpse into your, yes, thank you. It was wonderful. For that glimpse into your mind and your life. As you can sense, we are fascinated by your life in Japan, and we wish we could get another glimpse in it. I had lunch with Pico today, and he talked to me about the ping pong that he plays with the Japanese women, and that is, the sport is his mirror into connection with the Japanese. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Thank you, Doug, for that insightful cross-conversation that you had about identity, nationhood. I'm hoping to see some of that reflected in a column sometime. We know that will happen. I want to thank RBC and, of course, Maitri, our founding sponsor. But before I bring the evening to a close, and I know the bars and the patios beckon, I have one final announcement to make that I hope will give legs and expression to our operating philosophy of being both a think and a do tank, and of connecting global issues to local realities. We all know, and we've heard today a little bit, about the tragedy that is unfolding in Syria and about what is happening in the Mediterranean. The Syrian refugee crisis is the single largest humanitarian crisis after the Second World War. Canada and Toronto must do our bit in resolving the crisis, geopolitically, of course, but perhaps also extending our hearts and homes to those who need a heart and a home. I'm therefore really pleased to announce that GDX will take the lead in Toronto in welcoming the first 1,000 refugees and their families from Syria to Toronto. Thank you. Thank you. But I need to acknowledge the pushy John Sewell in this. Where is the pushy John Sewell? He's somewhere here. He's pushed me. There. Do I see him? No, somewhere there. But we have been working, yes, thank you, with a small, dedicated group of engaged citizens, including members of the Syrian community and NGOs, as well as, of course, Ryerson faculty. And we're about ready to launch in early June. But in order to be successful, we will need the active participation of people like you, your neighborhoods, your school associations, your book clubs, your formal and informal networks, as private sponsors to welcome and settle the refugees in their first year. Toronto knows how to do this. It has done this before. In 1980s, we started with welcoming 500 Indo-Chinese refugees. We took that number to 15,000. So I think our heart is big enough to do this again. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much. Go home and be still, as Pico would say.